Well, thank you all very much for coming out on a Tuesday night. It's great to see a good turnout, and I think that's because space and the Space Agency is something that's generated a lot of excitement. So I'm delighted to have Dr. Megan Clark here to talk to. And I thought I'd just start first by thanking my boss for reading out my CV. You don't often hear that, so that's nice. But with you, Megan, by saying one thing that I think is particularly striking about the Space Agency, you've only been around for just over a year, but you seem to have generated a whole lot of momentum. So, there's the strategy that you put out with some good, clear goals and growing the space sector in quite an ambitious way. But then a whole lot of agreements with countries, and then just at this, in the US, having that fantastic announcement that Peter mentioned about Project Artemis. So there's a lot of excitement and a lot of momentum. That's what it feels like from the outside. How does it feel on the inside?
Yeah, it does feel like that, and I think that's the one thing that really stands out for us after the first year is every state and territory. There's momentum. There's certainly been an increase of investment we've already seen, sort of inbound investment and investment in the sector that really didn't exist, I would say, a couple of years ago, and we've seen the Australian public get behind it as well, which makes a difference for government. I mean, the Australian public gets behind it, that sends a very strong message. And when we sort of split down to the few things that I think we sort of look back on that first 12 months, first of all, the engagement with the country. We set ourselves a goal of 5 million Australians. So 1 in 5, the first year would read about the agency. We thought that was a pretty good goal. And then we blew past that in the first 3 weeks. So we realised there was something else happening here. The country was really stepping in. And I think our engagement's now like 110 million in the first, just over the first 12 months. And that's saying that Australians multiple times engaging. So we were surprised. And I think what we were tapping into was that sentiment that we were there in the 60s. Right. And we have the capacity, we have the capability, we've got the ideas, we've got that kind of Aussie, the dish spirits. We've got something here that wasn't being fully utilised over those decades in perhaps the 70s and 80s and 90s. And so we tapped into that. And I didn't appreciate it fully until I was in Bremen with our first conference, and the Aussie booth was just going off, just totally going off. We had Australian Space, and for the first time the Australians, not the agency, but the Australians had a place, and they were just there in droves. This was even before we served the wine, and you could see it was coming. That wasn't even an Australian one, and they came in, and the UK shut their booth, and they just said, we give in, and they came across to ours, and they just said, it's all here. And then the head of the UK Space Agency said to me, I don't have my nation behind me. Mm-hmm. And he said, don't take this for granted. Clearly, the nation's behind you. I've seen the momentum. So that was, one, a good surprise, but also has helped create the momentum. We changed the laws, so we upgraded the laws in August. A very long period of time up to that, so I wouldn't suggest that we did that all in the first month, but actually there was about 10 years of work for that. But really important to set the stage that we were modernising our laws. That sent a very strong message internationally.
I was going to ask you about that. What about the laws and regulations had to be changed? Because I know there were some constraints on, say, companies thinking about launch activities, for example.
There was a couple of things. First of all, that was silent on things like launching a spacecraft from an aircraft. Mm-hmm. So our law was silent on some of the more modern things. High-powered rockets was not in our Space Act, so we needed to bring that over from CASA and define what we meant by high-powered rocket. So those aspects were there. And then some of our aspects of the legal framework were prohibitive in the insurance requirements. Didn't really anticipate CubeSats and nanosats and universities putting up satellites. And so we had to adjust the insurance regime so that we weren't preventing this whole new era, if you like, of smaller satellites, etc. And at a certain level, we've decided not to have any insurance, but for the nation to take on some of that responsibility for some of the smaller satellites as well. So we needed to adjust quite a few things in the framework. Our law still does not provide for the launch of humans from Australian sovereign territory. And so in our 10-year strategy, we've said we actually need to look at changing the law as well. So even now that we've made an update, we're already working on other updates and technical aspects. So changing the law was important. Opening the door was important. And this was a message we had from the nation, said there's something we're missing. We just don't have one door, one voice. And the one voice was the coordination, but opening the door. Now, I can remember writing this in the review. You're going to write, we need one door, one door. But the minute we had the door, so it's funny when you write policy and then you kind of see it in real life. And there was no question that we were completely missing out. There was no avenue for these agencies that only engage agency to agency, only have the mechanism government to government, and we needed to do that. But we need to do something different. We've now opened the door with many countries for our researchers and industry. But we also knew this was kind of the era of moving from government to commercial, so how do we engage the commercial? And that was an area that we sort of tried something completely different.
Yeah, so that sounds like there was a distinctive approach from the Australian Space Agency that some of your international partners don't do. That I saw that you've got agreements with about 11 different companies. There was that high-profile one announced in the US with Maxar, but that's just one of a number. So did that surprise any of your government space agency counterparts internationally that you were doing this?
Yeah, it did. It was an interesting, for the people in this room who are used to setting policy, we knew that the entire sector globally was working out how to move from government to commercial, and the bigger players were grappling with this issue internally and working out how to do these partnerships. So we knew we had to figure out how to do that straight away from day zero. So one of the first things we did was how do we engage directly in sort of joint strategic work with industry. So I do remember the whiteboard moment, where we sat down with the lawyers, etc., and said, well, we need to do these agreements with industry, or you can't call them agreements. Government can't do that. Oh, okay. So, well, what if we just don't call them agreements? Okay, that's what I thought. Well, they said, well, no, government can't be seen to support industry. So what if it's not in their competitive area? No, okay, maybe. So what if it's strategic? Maybe. Well, they have to be transparent. No? All right, so we wrote down all the things we couldn't do, and then we saw all the things how we could do. So we said, well, what if we publish them? Then they're transparent. Okay, so we worked our way through this, and we ended up with something called a statement of strategic intent. Can't call it an agreement. And
sorry, it wasn't an agreement. I didn't mean to say.
Yeah. But all we said was, here is what we're trying to do as the agency. Here's our strategic priorities. What are you going to do to help grow the industry? Not what you're going to do competitively. Right. That's not our role as government. But we want you to put your paw down in writing and commit to what you're going to do with R&D. What are you going to do with internships? What are you going to do to support our strategic objectives? And it was much more successful than we thought. So in answer to your question, our first one was with Airbus, and then the UK Space Agency said, we've been working with Airbus for 15 years and we don't have a statement of strategic intent. And this commitment, and what we wanted to do was, for no expenditure, if you like, of government dollars, have in writing how the industry was going to support this policy move. So it was much more successful than we thought, and other countries are looking to start to copy that, and we published them. So it was very clear what company was going to do, and I would say that's been one of the things that's helped with the momentum, having this visible internationally and nationally, and saying,
including with the corporate side of things,
exactly,
government. Yeah.
Exactly.
What's in it for the companies? Like, why would a company like Maxar think, hey, this is a great, not agreement, statement of strategic intent to have with the space agency?
Yeah, that's a good question. What's in it for them? Well, I think one, they realised that we did have a good engagement with the public. So there was the profile. If we signed an agreement, it definitely helped them showcase what they were doing here quite instantaneously. And the other piece is for the companies themselves, they had to get approval from head office, because you were publishing this the minute it was signed, so it was going up as an official document. they then had to explain what were they doing in Australia, particularly the international players. So then it had to go to head office, and then head office had to sign off, and what the hell's happening in Australia? So again, it built momentum and it built commitment from the head offices of the international players, and then of course the Australian players, they wanted to be seen to be part of it. So there was benefits all round, I would say. Maxar, our most recent agreement, Maxar are quite a leader in both robotics and advanced observation and intelligence, artificial intelligence, a well-known player and playing in the supply chains. And we've agreed to work with them on both those areas of robotics and artificial intelligence. So again, part of building a momentum, and as I said, honestly, it didn't, other than our own shoe leather, there was not a dollar of taxpayers' money spent to do that. So it was I think, a good move.
And think about the companies, so the countries. So there's been Germany, Japan, obviously the NASA one, New Zealand as well, I think, recently. What have you got specific goals for the different country partners? And is there something you can tell us about that?
Yeah, so we haven't signed with Japan. It's a very good question. In our strategy, one of the pillars is opening these doors internationally. And then we look at what that country's doing, what we're doing, we engage with them on our strategic areas. So for example, we just signed with DLR, the German Space Agency, and in particular, Germany and Japan are very good at advanced communication, particularly using light for communication, next generation of light plus radio communication, a very important area for us strategically, and we'll be working with Germany in that particular area. When we were working, for example, with France, we were looking at both the Indo-Pacific in a geopolitical sense, but also areas of artificial intelligence on orbit. So we worked in different areas. We met with them many times and then tried to find those sweet spots. With New Zealand, we're looking at how we work across the Tasman in kind of joint opportunities, which we do with New Zealand in other areas. Where we're not, neither of us separately can perhaps get the sort of size for example, critical equipment or critical infrastructure, but working together, we can do more than perhaps we did separately. So New Zealand has a different flavour as well. Each one of them has a particular, particularly where both countries agree they want to work together.
Is New Zealand further along with launch activities? So they've got...
absolutely.
Rocket Lab company, which seems
is doing
like it's got a whole lot of energy.
Yeah, well, and we really admire that, particularly where Rocket Labs has carved out a place in the commercial market for some of the smaller launch, some of the smaller satellites doing very well, had very successful launches. We've launched Australian assets using Rocket Labs. We've had 2 launches with Australian assets on. And they've also walked through and worked through how you operate this area in an international environment, with considering some of the deep aspects of, you're talking about missile control regimes which need to be taken into consideration, export control, and so we certainly admire what New Zealand has been doing.
And back to the momentum, how much do you think you arrived at the right time? So Space 2.0, the sort of collapse in the cost structures of getting into space and being able to have small satellites, rather, those enormous bus-sized multi-billion-dollar assets that are really valuable but are multi-billion-dollar things. So how much of the momentum was, yes, there's a door now, there's a point of contact, and there's this revolution in how you can operate in space? Well,
I think you're being generous to say we arrived at the right time. The reality is we're pretty late to this party. Right. I think Iceland is now the only OECD country that doesn't have a space agency. So we were late to the party. So actually, I think part of the momentum was built on the frustration.
Right, it's sort of pent-up release.
Absolutely. There are a lot of people, some of them in this room, who spent over a decade, working on saying this is something that we should have, pushing forward. We had 2 false starts for a space agency in government that ultimately were not fully funded or supported. So the frustration was so significant that actually it had galvanised already in the country an effort by a lot of people to make this happen. And then that frustration then turned into, well, we better get behind it. We better get behind it and we better support it. We've seen that it's not a given, right, having had a couple of attempts as a country. So
it's sort of, well, this is our chance.
This is our chance. We've got to make it work. And that's certainly what we feel. The backing of industry, the backing of the country, the backing of the states and territories. So perhaps there was an element of timing, but actually I think certainly before I became involved, there was just so much good work and groundwork that had gone on that says now's the time. And we almost got to the point of embarrassment. We'd almost got to the sort of utopia moment of, well, New Zealand's got one.
That's true. I always remember Andrew Denton with the Sydney Olympics and his proposed theme, which was "As long as we beat New Zealand." Yeah, so it's a powerful motivator. Yeah, you mentioned the states and territories. Often with the tantalising attraction of Commonwealth money, there's a bit of an unseemly competition between the states and territories, and I think a bit of that happened about where was your headquarters going to be. But how would you say the states and territories are playing together now?
It's a really good question.
The good, the bad and the ugly,
well,
I suppose.
If you look at our goal, our goal is to transform and grow the Australian space industry. So it is the most commercial purpose of any agency in the world. And if you're going to transform and grow your industry, you can't do that just from the ACT. That activity happens in the states and territories. So we knew very early on that we needed to mobilise the energy and effort in the states and territories because each one of them had a strategy for high-level jobs, jobs across the states, jobs in regional as well as urban, as well as the cities. So each of them had the same dilemma, if you like, or the same motivator to diversify their economies with really high-end jobs. And if I look back on our first 12 months, myself and the deputy and one or two others of the agency, we visited all states and territories every 12 weeks. Mm-hmm. So we went out, and they woke up at different times. So the first times you go out and say, and we did it through the Premier's Department, we'd say, well, here's what we know is happening in your state. And they didn't even know half of it. Mm. So they go, really? Wow, that's fantastic. Didn't know that. Tasmania wasn't aware that SpaceX was doing their de-orbit tracking and out of Hobart. We weren't even aware of that till we visited Tasmania. So we went and said, here's what's already happening. And we had a lot of ground stations already, so there was a lot of activity. That really helped. And then they said, well, here's what we know. And then we would come back 12 weeks later and you could see that they'd kind of gone, wow, this is kind of exciting. How do we attract some of this in? We shared with them the project pipeline. So we shared, here's what we know about the capital investment that is planned for your state or your territory. That really excited them because we were starting to see an increase in that capital investment and we could track that. We go back 12 weeks later and say, you know what we told you 12 weeks ago? Well, already we know there's more investment, this company's coming in, here's what's happening. So we helped lay out that which was happening. And then, of course, you come to the second meeting and they want to demonstrate that they know what's happening in their state and territory. So they've done some work, right. And then this sort of built on each other. And by the time we got to the third meeting, they're going to get sick of us by now. So we get to the third meeting and, suddenly the picture we've got with each other. And then they're saying, well, how do you help us with this? And so that, if I look back, that shoe leather out in the states and territories was probably one of the most significant things to build the momentum.
Do you think they have settled into a bit of an understanding about where their different comparative strengths are, or do they have that shared picture amongst themselves, or is it more individual states with you?
I think they have a much better sense, and many of them have now moved to their own policy and strategy documents. So New South Wales moving to what they want to do with the small to medium enterprises, which they're a very significant player in what they're doing with Aerotropolis. South Australia had quite a comprehensive strategy in how they were going to engage. Western Australia, leads the ground station segment. So they were starting to build their own strategy. So after about 15 months, we now have MOUs with many of the states and territories, and we're seeing them bring out their own strategies. The next stage is to bring out to the comprehensive list of what companies they have in each of their areas, and they're starting to make the agreements. But that is certainly building, and actually we'll go around and do another one of those as well. So I think that was an important lesson, that you've got to get out there and see the country. And then when we did the legal aspect, so we got the legal team, we said, well, you have to go to each state and territory. And they were like, really? Can't we just set the laws? It's like, no, you have to go out there. And they said, what if they ask us questions we can't answer? I said, oh, they'll ask you questions you can't answer. But that's part of it. Just go out there. Believe me, they'll appreciate it. But you have to publish what rules you changed in the Space Act. So we have the Act and the law, and then we have the rules that underpin it. Yep. What rules did you change because of that consultation? Right. And what rules didn't you change because of these reasons? So you had to explain. You know, you listened and you moved us here, but you haven't moved us here because this is important. And they published that, and the feedback on that was great. They go, yeah, we did move you.
Well, it's a way of measuring how much you listen to them, wasn't it?
Exactly. You know, if you're going to consult, you have to share where the thinking was really moved. And then the teams came back and said, every state and territory is different, which I think Billy Connolly noticed as well, you know, that Australia's not all like Canberra. And that was kind of eye-opening for them as well. So it
was good for them.
It was good for our team as well.
Now, we talked before the start about if you had to choose between Star Trek and Star Wars, you would choose Star Trek.
Star Trek, yeah.
I said I was a Star Wars kind of person.
Oh, you
I suppose that lets me now think about the dark side. So think about national security in space. So in the same time that the agency has come into being, there's been a much sharper crystallising of great power competition and the sort of strategic and economic struggle that's underway, particularly between the United States and China, Xi Jinping's Chinese state. I'm just wondering, are you seeing that flavouring the international space environment?
It's a good question because there are a lot of issues in that. So what we're seeing in both civil and defence domain is that space and the access to space data has never been more important and never been more pervasive across multiple domains, and we see that. So space really as a defining environment across multiple domains. In the civil space area, which is the area that we are responsible for, you start to look at some of the issues of the contestability of space. So we're seeing the industrialisation of the low Earth orbit. So you think of the International Space Station at 400 kilometres above us, so the low Earth orbit sitting below that area. And we're starting to see one of the most fundamental changes, which is these constellations of low Earth orbit satellites, 12,000 for SpaceX. If you just look at the ones that are looking to be registered in Australia as a foreign space object, which is the first part to be able to apply for the spectrum use here in this country. If you just look at those companies such as Kepler from Canada, SpaceX with their Starlink, we've got OneWeb looking here as well. You start to look at these companies putting up these constellations, and this will be an area not just in terms of crowded of these constellations, but it's also where we have to worry about the debris, we have to worry about the frequency overlap. One of the most instructive documents that I've read in the last few weeks was the application to the US FAA of one of these companies looking to put up satellites, and it was really interesting to see where it was contentious. You know, the FAA themselves said, wait a minute, so you had the frequency issues, that's going to overlap with the NOAA weather satellites. You had SpaceX, putting in an objection saying, this could create debris that could hit the International Space Station. So you had the debris issue as well. And you started to unpick some of these issues that are coming in the contested and congested space, where we may have a sort of plethora of small satellites that are uncontactable,
you can't maneuver them as well.
unidentifiable, and not controllable because small satellites don't yet have the propulsion capabilities.
So they can't avoid each other as well.
To manoeuvre themselves. So you start with those issues, and these issues are very common to what we're seeing in anyone using the space domain as well. So certainly those areas, as I said, the Space Agency does not have legislative powers for national security. In those areas, we simply work in collaboration with the other agencies.
And how is that collaboration with the national security sector in Australia going?
Yeah, actually, I would say we've established governance arrangements on multiple levels. So for national security, we work through Home Affairs and the National Security Place. DFAT, of course, looks after our treaties with United Nations. This is a really important area when you come to the rules in space, the rules around debris, and then for us that translates to what we actually put in our legislation, how we are asking applicants to deal with space debris, and defence. So we also work with defence on these issues, and then in reverse, we're working with defence on how do we build our sovereign industrial base in a way that will support our efforts as well in space at a broader context. So that's one area of coordination. We coordinate through the agencies. The second area is we have what we call a National Coordination Committee, which meets regularly, and that discusses issues. It can also discuss...
And who's on that body?
Actually quite broad. So we have the key departments as well, but also some of the agencies such as the Bureau of Meteorology, CSIRO. We have different agencies, Geoscience Australia for precise positioning, and those groups look at our international agreements. We look at security aspects as well. We look at issues such as ground stations. So we have that coordination committee, and then we have what we call our formal and informal arrangements. So at a formal level, we will have a representation from Defence on our advisory board, and then informally we have people from Defence stationed inside the agency as well. So we try and sort of stitch this up, and then obviously in the technology side, relationships with DSTG and things like that. So we're trying to do a very thought through and rigorous formal and informal integration at the very beginning, and we formalise part of that in the agency charter, which is our guiding governance document.
Do you think, is there a lot of shared priority around things like industry capability? Because obviously some of the applications, Earth observation and analytics of geospatial data, that would be a very common need and a common priority between defence and civil space users. But how about on the industrial capabilities, things like launch vehicles and precision guidance systems, advanced sensors? Are they shared priorities, do you think, for how the space industry develops?
Yeah, some of the areas are shared. So we set the 7 civil space priorities, so position, navigation and timing, so that Australia is both caught up with the world but also leads the world in precise positioning in the capital cities. Now, positioning, navigation and timing for defence is really in whichever arena you are involved in, but we overlap in that particular area. The second area is advanced communication, and I think this is probably one of the areas that has the most significant overlap. So as we're looking in the civil area to position Australia for the next generation of communication in space, which will involve light in space, so the use of photons to be able to lift up to terabit per second or more than 10 terabits a second of bandwidth, but also security. So you can't listen into a laser. That's the advantage. Or if you do, you can see that intercept. The disadvantage is your receiver and transmitter need to lock on before you can communicate, right? So if you're using radio, I mean, we can still listen to Voyager, which is in interstellar space, sending out a tiny signal from something as small as you see in your fridge, and its signal is kind of now dispersed over a distance which is, I think, half the distance to the sun or something.
It hasn't had to do an immediate lock on the, yeah.
And we can still hear, these, well, we can in Tidbinbilla, so Canberra is the only station that can still hear Voyager. So that's the advantage of the radio spectrum. But the disadvantage of that is you can
Everyone
intercept
can
it.
hear it.
Yeah. So there's disadvantages and advantages, and we think there'll be a combination. Now that is really important to the civil market, but we don't want Australia to get behind. I'd say Germany, Japan, we're not exactly sure of where the US is on this, but for a country that invented Wi-Fi, we don't really want to be left behind on this next gen, and we're a big country, so this really matters to us. So that's an area where we set that as a civil space priority, and we are pursuing projects in that area. ANU is doing a fantastic project on setting up a laser ground station network in the country. And then you have, parallel to that, but overlapping the SATCOM, the Defence SATCOM priority. So that's a really important area. Robotics, of course, starting to be important. So we can be complementary. We don't set defence policy, but we can be complementary to building that internal capability.
Now, I'm going to ask you one more question before I turn to the audience, because I know they're getting a little restive wanting to ask you some of their questions. But this one is, are there any constraints coming your way out of the national security community? Because I'm thinking about things like university research partnerships that turn out to be advancing Ministry of State security capabilities in mainland China. That seems to me to be a bad thing to do. That's an example where there can be a constraint because of national security on civil sector activity. Do you see any of those indicators?
Well, I think at the broader sense, we have to be mindful of certainly the missile technology regime, a very important one if we're going to look at launch. We have to be very mindful, and we have been mindful for a long time, on the defence export controls, and we have to be mindful of the partners. So looking at the partners that are engaging, and not just the agency, but the players, the civil players in Australia, making sure that they're doing their due diligence on their partnerships. And we also have to be mindful of our multilateral and bilateral agreements that we have existing. So sitting at that broadest level, we have been, and we need to continue to be mindful of those, and we certainly are at the agency. I mean, the question you asked is that causing a restriction? I'm not saying that it's causing undue restriction, but we are absolutely mindful to make sure we move and navigate through, as you would expect, making sure that we are honouring those commitments and agreements, and making sure that the agreements that we, in terms of areas that we fund, that we're certainly covering that. What we want to do is build, obviously, intellectual property in this country, so that we have our own sovereign capacity. Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.